Hey, so good morning. I am going to do my best to be brief here because I do want to really show some things that have been sort of fresh on my heart through some different studies that talk about the conversion process that we saw in John chapter 3, where Nicodemus and Jesus are speaking. You know, that's that famous chapter where verse 16, we're very familiar, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. However, it has some interesting nuances to it, and you can go back and read it later, but for time's sake, I just want to mention this. So in chapter 3, Nicodemus approaches Jesus at night, and he basically gives a lot of accolades and praises to Jesus, and Jesus cuts right to the chase and basically says, here's what, in order to see the kingdom, you've got to be born again. You've got to be born of water and spirit. And he goes into detail about these things. But there's a little pushback from Nicodemus. And Nicodemus either, discussing this concept of rebirth, either is doing it quizzically, he doesn't really know, or he's doing it sarcastically about the impossibility of going back into his mother's womb to be born. And Jesus sort of shames him, a little mild shaming, but says, hey, you're Israel's teacher. You should understand these things. And certainly there have been others who've gone back at this concept of looking at what Nicodemus should have known. And so if you look back, and you can do a word study and look at where water and spirit are together, and if they talk about purification, if they talk about spirit giving life, certainly there's some passages that speak to that. And I do think that that's probably in line with what Jesus is talking about those elements of the rebirth process, about water and spirit being involved. And I'm mentioning a few of them here. I'm not going to read them. Isaiah 44 is one, Ezekiel 36, and then finally in Joel chapter 2. And very prominent and very good. However, what I want to do right now is those passages, they do connect water and spirit, but they don't really allude or implicitly talk about birthing. And so what we find, though, in the Jewish really thought process, if you look at the scholarship, many go back and they look at the point where Moses is leading his people out of Egypt, and really from the time of the Passover, the whole issue of leaving and that moment has so many birthing images. And I just want to quickly describe some of them, and you can look back at them on your own. But it was really unique to me in kind of re-looking at this birthing process. And so let's look back. So we understand that Israel, before they went to Egypt, they came as families. They descended into Egypt as families and subfamilies. They then propagated with all these different families, but they were yet to be really described as a nation. And even up to that time, God didn't even really describe them as firstborn or anything like that. And so they grew under this lineage of Abraham. But it wasn't until after Passover they were first described really as a nation. So there's this really transition from them being independent individuals and more family-oriented to nation status after this event. And Jewish scholars, they've seen the uniqueness of this, even the offering, the Passover offering, which is this lamb that's given for slaughter, that it was brought not simply by an individual, and not simply as a family or communal, but it was like there was a hybrid between both elements. So it had this communal aspect, and it also had this individual aspect to it. It was really seen, if you look at it, it was seen from the Jewish perspective as a bridge, an offering by which the community of Israel was really created. Okay, so the first birth imagery that we see is really when Moses warned Pharaoh about the first plagues hitting Egypt. And we see God using the term in Exodus 4 and designating them as his firstborn. And later we see the second portion too is that the night of Passover, the Jews were instructed to slaughter the sheep or the lamb, and cover the doorpost with blood. And it mentions the lintel and the threshold. And so that's the top and the sides, but also the basin is also mentioned. And the blood is to be spread across the entire element. So the entire door frame, along with the base, was covered in blood. Then it goes on to say that the position of the lamb, when you look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 9, is that it's to be roasted with fire, complete, with the head over the knees, over the stomach. And it's inferred by different scholars, Rabbi Foreman in particular, that this rendition of this verse is really inferred based on the fact that the whole thing had to be consumed. But if you look at that imagery-wise, it has kind of a fetus type of look to it, with the head over the feet, over the stomach. And so you get a little bit more birthing imagery. And so that's inferred by Foreman. Not other English translations have it that way. So this fetus position is also described. So Deuteronomy also goes on to describe Israel that night having to wait patiently, and then it says at daybreak they exit in haste. They basically explode through that door, through that bloody door, into the open, and the whole process goes on from there. And so you have all this imagery, if you are willing, that this imagery, these echoes, we have the process of them waiting behind the door, this bloody door talking about just the exit through the womb. You've got the gestation period for them staying back, and then the birthing imagery with them exiting quickly through this. And the other thing that adds to this imagery is the fact that the time period when God speaks to Moses at the time of describing what the offering, the lamb offering is, he says this is day 0 for the Jewish calendar, and basically that's birthday language. So God spoke to Moses. It's over here in Exodus 12. God spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be to you the beginning of the months, and it shall be the first month for you, and the first year." This delineates the beginnings. So there is birthing going on, and there seems to be some resemblances to that. And so, this is most interesting. Foreman, in his book Leviticus, a Parsha Companion, writes this. He says, "The analogy to birth seems unmistakable. All night long, in the dark, we waited behind these closed doors, and in the morning we rushed through the doorway covered in blood. We were born. Before that night, what were we? We were just a bunch of aggregated families, but that night, as we went through that door, a new entity came into being, a single entity, the nation of Israel." And so, really interesting imagery about this aspect of birth. And so, when you look back and revisit Nicodemus in that conversation with Jesus, could he be inferring the fact that this is what he should have known, as far as what the birth is all about? I've always viewed the passage in John 3, this moment, from an individualistic framework, that this is where I'm born again. And true, that has that statement. We don't want to leave that. But what's really interesting is that when Jesus says, you must be born again, I've always looked at that as a singular statement, but it's actually described in the plural. So in verse 7 of John 3, it would be, you all must be born again. So he's even speaking not on the individualistic scale, but on the collective. So all these things coming together, and so if this is true, that this is what Nicodemus was referring to, the question comes up, so what? And so I think there's some thoughts I want to connect. We remember the passage over in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, talking about we're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Those same words, where did that come from? Those same words come from this whole Exodus moment, Exodus 19. They're spoken at Sinai by God to Moses, and it's recalling the rescue operation out of Egypt. And so Peter, in describing these things as far as holy nation, is leaning into the collective and communal aspect of conversion, and not just the independent thing. So it is an individual moment, but it's also a collective. It's bringing us in, and we've known that. We've heard the phrases, you're born into a family. But this is intense to talk about what's really happening at this moment. So how does it affect how we as Christians are viewing things today? His church. What does that look like? Again, today is not about shaming us and the fact that maybe we aren't as involved within our worship or our church services or anything like that, but rather the intention is to relook at conversion as both an individual bridge to purification, but also a bridge transforming purely individualistic motives into collective motives. So I want to take some time. Kayla and I are going to speak about these things here, and the questions still arise. What does this look like? And you'll see at the end, we throw some things out, but I think we all need to have conversations on this level and what this matters. So thanks. Okay, so we've been talking about this aspect of being reborn, stepping a little bit more into a place of looking at as a birth process into community rather than just our independent movement towards having our sins forgiven and given the Spirit, which is wonderful. Yet it brings in this whole kind of imagery of coming into a larger space with people. And you and I have been talking a little bit as far as what that looks like. And I want to do a disclaimer, I think it's important, is that, guys, we've been living in a smaller group, a smaller community for the last six years now. I think we're on our 7th year or 6th year.
No, we're on our 6th year.
We're on our 6th year. And, just getting into a small group doesn't change patterns. I think we've found that out. It doesn't change patterns of, if we were very individualistic and not team-oriented or connecting-oriented, it doesn't mean that naturally we become that just because we're in small group. So this is challenging, and I think one of the things I'd like to just talk about a little bit is that we have seen things that have really solid ways in which we've seen different from in the past as far as doing things on an independent level to a community level, and we can speak about those things and give you a second to just bring a few of those things up that you've seen as far as us walking over the last few years together.
Well, I think even going back to the study that you did where that whole Passover feast that they had prior to the Exodus as a rebirth into a complete nation really does put an importance on our birth into the family of God, and he calls us a holy nation. So his intent, even at our baptism, is to create in us an understanding of our involvement on a larger scale. And I think reading through this has just reminded me of how important that is to God, and it's important for us to, in faith, walk in that. It reminded me a little bit, this might be completely off topic, but it reminded me a little bit, I'm a science teacher, and right now I have kids, 3rd graders, who are doing, they're doing an electricity project. And one person could kind of maybe do it alone, but in the time period I'm giving them, which is just 3 class periods, it's really tough for one person to do it alone. And but when you put 4 3rd graders together, everyone has their own idea. Everyone's pulling which way. Some people don't want to be involved. Some people want to be hyper involved. So it's a real challenge for them to get to work together. And we had a discussion the other day when there were 2 people that were kind of infighting. I said, when you disrupt what they're trying to learn through this, you're hurting the whole project. And I think that for me, I've had to own independence. I want so badly to hold on to that, but that hurts the whole. It's just like in our marriage. When I say or do something that damages you in your spirit, then ultimately it damages the two of us.
Right.
And our marriage doesn't thrive, and it doesn't go on the path that God wants us to go on. So
stop doing that.
So I think this has really brought to mind just how important it is on a level I think that I don't think of on a general day-to-day level, how important my connection and my relationship is with the people that God has given me in my community. So I think I wanted to mention that.
No, that's a good point. And getting, like Mikhail and I were talking about through, what are some practicals and in regards to what it means to be, as we look at this new birthing imagery, what does that look like for us? And I think that's really up to you to kind of work through as a group too, and as individuals, collectively, not just with the whole group, but even with small pods of people too.
Well, you had several of the scriptures that you have looked at today had to do with the Spirit, and honestly, we talk about the Spirit, but in terms of listening to Him and being prompted by Him, it's something that I have been trying to be much more sensitive to, and I think the Spirit really is the driver behind. It's kind of the glue that makes a community a community. So, for example, I was on Instagram the other day, and there was someone just giving a shout out to a girl who happens to be a part of my community, just telling on Instagram how loved she felt by this person, because it was this girl's birthday, and when she went to an event that they had together, this one girl, McCall, made it just super special. And I just was so proud of McCall being called out in that way. And then I was prompted in my spirit, honestly. I believe it was the Spirit of God. And I just texted her a quick, "You love well." And then she wrote me back, and we just were texting back and forth. But it's listening to those moments of recognizing in others' strengths, recognizing in others' ways that they contribute to the overall blessing of the kingdom. And so I think it's listening to those promptings and walking in it, because that's what many of these scriptures talk about, is that the Spirit is going to come on us. And why is He coming on us and in us except to help us move towards this larger community?
One of the things that we had talked about too is how community changes the way that we even read the Bible. And we've read the Bible so often just independently that we take a passage like the one that Paul taught, or Paul speaks to the Bereans, or God mentions it, that the Bereans were a more noble character in Acts than the Thessalonians, because they examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. And I would look at that, I mean, you probably too, we'd look at that as, everybody went back home to their little homes, took out their scrolls, everybody had their independent scrolls.
Which they didn't.
No, they didn't have any of that. So they had to have gone back to probably a local synagogue where they could take these scrolls out and collectively read through them as a community, and then talk through them. And one of the things that I know that we have been decent at in seeing God's Spirit working in community is studying and listening to God speak through others, as far as when they read a passage or they've seen something different. It really makes a difference. And so
we had a discussion last week about what are some parables that just bother you, that you just don't understand, and they're confusing. And so we shared about that, and we shared about it from a perspective of not, I'm sharing this so that everybody can help me understand it, but rather know me a little bit more because this is confusing to me. And then we also shared about what are the ones that really draw you closer to God. But I know we had a couple of Wednesdays, we meet at a brewery, and the idea was, let's bring our confusion together. And it was really cool because there were times where we brought up some scriptures where when it was initially brought up, maybe one of the parables, and someone was like, I don't like that story at all. But by the end of it, because of our discussion, and I believe the Spirit moving among all of that, that we all got to a place of, okay, maybe I'm not an expert in it, and I can't explain all of the nuances to it, but boy, I understand now the heart of God better now that we've talked about it together than I did before. So I think that's the strength of community and the I guess the decision, the deliberate decision you have to make to put yourself out there, and the blessing that God gives you when you do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and you know, there's so many different ways. And again, talking about the point of I think God saying, you know, or looking at this imagery as birthing imagery in a community is not to, you know, get us to attend more meetings and stuff. And Mikhail and I were talking about that earlier. Meetings are important, but I think we have operated so much in a meeting type of way that what does it mean to be committed, that word, committed to the kingdom? Well, when I look at it, it's not a commit. I've got my sister who lives down the road. I've got my family. I've got AJ, Mac, Ben, and Kayla, you, and we're a fan. We're all connected. I don't look at it as a commitment. I've got to be committed to you guys. It's kind of when I realize birthing imagery, I go, no, this is real, very, very real,
Significant,
and it becomes more than I can still go to a Sunday morning and worship together, and go to a Wednesday if we have Wednesdays and worship together, but it goes beyond just I'm coming to meetings, because I think we're so much in that mindset that you almost have to have a different cleansing of your mind as far as the paradigms, the things, the narratives that we told about what it means to be, not just in the kingdom, but what does it mean to be born into this family or this nation. It's a holy nation, which I never really looked at that connection between that imagery. So, well, this is just a little tidbit. We've gone for a few minutes here just to talk about a few things, but not to give all the answers, because we don't have all the answers. And that's okay, but I do think it's a really good conversation for all of us to have, to talk about what does it mean to go beyond just I'm glad I'm saved and I can just live my life and do my thing, versus no, I'm part of a larger entity here, a bigger thing here. So hopefully this is food for thought. You guys can have more conversations, you know, later in your meetings, but just continue to look at these things. So I think it's a huge thing, and it's been, and again, I don't want this just to be a new knowledge-based information that we just came out with here, but to really take it for what God, I think, is looking at. So thank you.
Love you.
Have a good day. Bye.